Actually, I am the King Faisal Chair and the Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity from sunny California, but what's 50 degrees among friends? It is really good to be back in Michigan, and I just want to say how warmed my heart is to see so many faces that made my life during the time that I lived here and my family lived here so meaningful in terms of our existence as Muslims. And I can't tell you how precious this greater Detroit Muslim community is in terms of the way that Muslim communities go throughout America. You have been blessed with a wealth of brotherhood and sisterhood and with a wealth of potential. And I pray that Allah Ta'ala will bless you to be able to capitalize on all that you've been blessed with. All you have to do is travel around the country a little bit to know just how much you have. In fact, I have to admit this, when I came here this afternoon, they asked me to lead the prayer, and I almost made a big giant mistake. I almost did the takbirat for Eid, because when I was here we used to have the Eid prayer right in this building, and so I said Allahu Akbar, and I was about to, and I caught myself. Walhamdulillah. Let me start out where my dear brother Haris Ahmed sort of left off. We are living, I think, in times of clarity. And I think that it's important for us to understand as a Muslim community, without wishing to be a bearer of doomsday kinds of scenarios, but we are living in difficult times. And the reality is that in the short term, they're likely to get more rather than less difficult. And I think that rather than fretting this, and rather than allowing this to plunge us into deeper and darker depths of fear, we have to recognize the cost, the price of progress. The cost, the price of moving beyond where we are. America is changing. And it is changing because it must. The demographics of America are such that there are people in certain places and vested interests who have grown very accustomed of assuming their entitlement to a certain status in society, a status that empowers them to treat others in a way that leaves them comfortable, even perhaps at the expense of those others. And now we are in a situation when those others are speaking up, they are standing up, and they are insisting that they have a right to a dignified existence along with everyone else. And this means that America is going to have to renegotiate its social order. And things that might have been okay in the past, things that people may have gotten away with in the past, will no longer be that way in the future. And this means that, and we have to understand this, that many of those who are part of the dominant group in America have to make some adjustments in their hearts and in their souls. And this is a very, very difficult thing to do. And anybody who's called upon to do that will resist it. And it is that very act of resistance that's likely to make things more rather than less difficult for us as we go forward. And as a Muslim community, we must be prepared to pay the price of a dignified existence in America. And this will not be for the faint of heart. And no community is gifted with a better example a better model of what it means to be dedicated, to be committed, to have dignified perseverance than the Muslim community. And that model is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So let us prepare ourselves to take our rightful place in our society. But let us not be mistaken. There will be difficulties. And we will have to face those difficulties with dignity. And it's in that context that I want to say something before I get into my talk proper. You know, I travel all around the country, and I want to say a word to a group of Muslims that I believe are really the unsung heroes of the American Muslim community. And I'm talking here about religiously committed Muslim women who wear hijab. And I want to be clear about something here. I want to be clear. I'm not here to place anyone above anyone else. Hijab is part of what it means to be a Muslim woman, not all. And hijab cannot substitute for genuine iman, genuine faith, and genuine commitment to Allah. But I think everybody has to acknowledge that it's difficult out there. It's really tough out there. And whether you're a man or woman, Muslim or non, I think that if you have any question about what Muslim women are made of, then ask yourself this question: would I be able to do what they are able to do on a daily basis? How would I feel showing up for a job interview in hijab? How would I feel having to go to an interview for promotion in hijab? How would I feel traveling through airports in hijab? How, in fact, would I feel going into certain restaurants or certain neighborhoods in hijab? And yet, our Muslim sisters have to do this daily. And they are people who are more often spoken for. There's a voice out there in the media that speaks for them without ever speaking to them. And so they don't even get a chance to represent themselves as they are. And yet, they persevere. And I think that we as a Muslim community, we have to acknowledge the courage and the deep down profound inner strength that it takes for these women to be able to sustain that on a daily basis. And I want to honor them as the unsung heroes of the Muslim community. Now, with regard to the topic at hand, which is rooted in faith, growing through service, I want to start by just pointing out that service, if it's to be meaningful, it has to be principled. People who are not sincere, they will often try to fool society. They will try to manipulate society, even exploit society, all in the name of service. They want to bring society to a point where society feels a debt to them for the service that they have allegedly offered. Where in point of fact, what they're really doing is making a down payment on the pursuit of their own interests. And what we have to understand is that as a Muslim community, for our service to be meaningful, for it to have long-term effect, for it to be transformative of the society in which we live, it must be principled. And that means that in our offering of service, we have to be people of character, not just people of interests. And we cannot fall into this service discourse just in order to buy a little positive press or to deflect a little bit of negative attention. We have to truly be like those people about whom Allah says in the Quran, إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ لَا نُرِيدُ مِنْكُمْ جَزَاءً وَلَا شُكُورًا. We feed you for the sake of God. We do not want from you either any reward or any remunerative thanks. We do this for the pleasure of God. And I think that, as Brother Dawood said, one of the things that we have to understand about non-Muslim Americans, they're not stupid. And if we want to talk about building alliances, being able to enlist the goodwill of non-Muslims in society, we have to be people who demonstrate courage and principled commitment. That is what will bring the best out of non-Muslims in America. I remember a story written by a sports writer. And he was talking about Muhammad Ali, who I hope we will all keep in our dua. And Muhammad Ali at the time had been stripped of his title. And you got to remember, this is a man in his 20s, forfeiting millions. And I remember every time I see it on television, I get tears in my eyes. Muhammad Ali is sitting on television, he has his big FOI hat on. And they say, well, you know, you're going to be stripped of your title and you may go to prison. And he said the following: well, whatever the consequences may be, I will not renounce the religion of Islam. I'm ready to die. If they put me before a firing squad tomorrow, I'm ready to die. That's what he said. This sports writer said this. He said, my father was not a man who was all that given to all this civil rights jazz. And in fact, my father, in the last election, voted for George Wallace, the man who said what? Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He voted for George Wallace. When he saw Muhammad Ali make that statement, you know what he said? He said, you know, I don't really know a lot about this young man, but a man gets very few opportunities to stand up in life and be a man. And this man is standing up and being a man. And you know who his father voted for in the next election? George McGovern, the most liberal candidate, perhaps, I won't say most, but a very, very liberal candidate. He was transformed by the sincerity that he saw in Muhammad Ali, being willing to stand up and sacrifice for his own values. This is the model that we as a Muslim community must follow in America. And so when it comes to service, we must be sincere in our service. We must be people of character. We cannot be simply people of interest. And we should not be misled by the seemingly short-term gains that will ultimately undermine us in the long term. And we should not be misled by this. Non-Muslim Americans, they're a lot like Nietzsche, the German philosopher. Nietzsche once said, my genius is in my nostrils. I can smell him a mile away. And non-Muslim Americans, especially when it comes to religious people, they can smell insincerity a mile away. And let us not be like the man who goes down into the manhole and spends all day there, and his clothing absorbs all the stench of the manhole. but when he comes out, he can't smell it. And therefore, he thinks that other people can't smell it. We should not be that kind of a community. We have to be a community of principle and courage. And we should not allow anybody to run this psychological game on us to the effect that we have to be something other than that. We have to figure out what America is going to accept. America is our country. And what we are doing is asserting not only our right, but especially as Muslims, our responsibility to enter into the negotiation about what America is going to be. That's what we must understand ourselves to be. And I hope that this spirit will become something that's institutionalized in our midst. Because that is the spirit that will sustain generations to come. We don't want little flashes in the pan that in one generation or two generations are gone like a fad. We want a permanent presence of dignified existence as Muslims in America, as a part of the American fabric. And we want ultimately to be so vivacious in what we mean in this context that even non-Muslim Americans will understand that America cannot be herself without us. That is going to take character. Now, there are two levels of service that I want to say a few words about. One is the internal level, that is service to the Muslim community itself. And the other is external, service that goes beyond the Muslim community into the broader community at large. And one of the traps that we have to be careful not to fall into is that of seeing these two as being mutually exclusive. There are some who think, and they have been so pilloried, so emotionally and psychologically beaten up by the Islamophobic industry, that they have internalized this notion that if you work for Muslims, you're not working for America. In fact, if you work for the betterment of the Muslim community, you're working against America. We have to resist this fallacy. Good Muslims make what? Good Americans. Good Muslims who are good doctors, who are honest lawyers, like our Judge Adam Shakur, who are good cultural producers, make good Americans. Let us not fall into the trap of seeing ourselves as some kind of special interest community. What's good for us is good for the country. So there's no contradiction between working for ourselves and working for the society at large. Even when we disagree with the society at large. And I want to be very clear about something here. If we are going to be a community of principle, we have to be willing even to stand up and say when we disagree with society. And we have to be willing to accept the fact that not everybody is going to agree with us. Islam is not everyoneism. Not everyone is going to agree with us. But that is part of the very meaning of the pluralistic society in which we live. You don't have to agree with us. We don't have to agree with you. We have a process of negotiating disagreement, and that is what we are willing to do. We are willing to play by the rules. You should be willing to play by the rules. And now let's get it on and let America become the best that she can become. We have to be very, very careful about being psychologically bullied into this position where we feel that all we can do as Muslims is apologize, is adjust, is accept our status as a problem people. A problem people is a people about whom it is said, and I know a little bit about being considered a problem people. I know a little bit about that. A problem people is a people about whom it is said, something is wrong with you. And if you would just change that something, everything would be all right. And you know what happens? Typically, that something is changed, and then what happens? The goalpost moves. And what you end up as is a modern slave. You end up dominated. You have had your story taken away from you, and you have been given a supporting role in somebody else's story. And yet you turn around and say, this is my country. If this is my country, then I have a right to my story. And let our stories come together. And let us produce a symphony. Let us produce some harmony. Not a single voice, many voices. But mine certainly an identifiable part of that symphony. We have to be very careful about this. Now, on the internal level, in terms of service to the community, I want to say just two things, because I realize I'm standing between you and dinner. And your faces might start getting a little. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to wear out my welcome. But I think that it's important for us to recognize something here. That we're living in challenging times. And most of the challenges that are uppermost in our minds today are social political challenges. It's ISIS, it's Boko Haram, it's Syria, it's Libya, it's North Carolina even. And these are all difficult and profoundly relevant challenges. And I would be at the height of irresponsibility to say that these challenges are not important. But I want to invite you to just remember this. That is that in addition to all these social political challenges, Muslims have everyday just plain old human challenges. Muslims, there are people in this room who are struggling to keep their children Islamically engaged. And part of the challenge there is that their children have been socialized in America. They may have been socialized back home, or maybe even back in the day, like me. Back home and back in the day, that socialization produced a whole different universe of values and virtues. But their children don't have the advantage of that. Their children live in a culture, the dominant culture of which does not really value, let us say, things like forgiveness, things like patience, things like sexual propriety, sexual virtue, things like honor. And yet, these young people find themselves socialized by all this and then trying to reconcile Islam with a culture that says, go out and be all you can be. Go for the gusto. And here is Islam saying, wait a minute, you want to live fully, but also righteously. Fully, but righteously. And you have here in this room parents who are struggling to find that balance. Young people who are struggling to find that balance. We have couples who are struggling to keep their marriage alive. Not just, hi honey, salam alaikum, but to keep it alive. And my point here is this. We cannot allow the notion of service to overlook these fundamental basic human needs. we must serve our community in the way of being good brothers and sisters, reliable shoulders to lean on, confidants in whom we can share our deepest worries and concerns without worrying about our picture showing up on the masjid wall, without worrying about our business being plastered all over Facebook or something like that. Muslims need each other. We need each other. We need brothers and we need sisters. We need people to help us bear the burden sometime of parenthood or of being imam or being a CAIR president. We need that service as well. And that service should never be seen as less than the service to those issues that catch all the headlines. Because ultimately, it is what we are to each other that will determine the texture of our collective existence. What we are to each other. And here, I have to say something that I might not say in other venues. Because here, I know people know me. And therefore, even if they disagree with my words, they can hear my heart. They understand that we are all on the same team. One of the services that we must render to the Muslim community, and don't worry about this dirty laundry business. Nix that nonsense. Because as I've said elsewhere, if a person doesn't cut their grass for 3 months, you don't have to look at their laundry to know what kind of person they are. And if we are not a healthy Muslim community, don't think society can't see that. They can. One of the services we have to bring to this Muslim community in this place, in this time, is we have to overcome this tendency to engage in gotcha Islam. What do I mean by that? We have to be a community that is not punitive in its orientation. A community that does not want to punish, that does not relish the idea of punishment, gotcha. But a community that always, even in punishment, and Islam has punishments, but even in that, always wants to build human beings up, never wanting to tear them down. And I'm going to even go out on a bigger limb, or what do you call it, a weaker limb, and say this. Many of us are carriers of an authoritarian, dictatorial impulse. And you know where we got it from? 200 years of dictatorial, authoritarian, tyrannical rule in Muslim countries throughout the world. And many of us have imbibed this as the prism through which we now see Islam. Islam as social control. And many of these places want to use Islam as a social control because if you control society, then society can't control you. And many of us, unbeknownst to ourselves, have imbibed this. And therefore, our tendency is to want to pounce, is to want to be punitive in our orientation. And I'm not here to argue this anything goes Islam. This is nonsense. But let me just share one example of this from the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A man comes to the Prophet and says, "O Rasulullah," and by the way, this is in Sahih Muslim. This is not some lost hadith. This is Sahih Muslim. Comes to the Prophet and says, what? "O Rasulullah, I have committed a sin. So apply the punishment of the book of God to me." He says this to the Prophet. You know what the Prophet said to him? didn't you just make salat with us? Didn't you just offer the prayer with us? He said, yes. The prophet said what to him? You have been forgiven. You have been forgiven. Now, many of us are uncomfortable with this kind of stuff because they see it as what? Opening the door wide open for all kinds of indiscretion. But we have to understand that the Prophet ﷺ was a man who was dedicated to producing strong, empowered, confident Muslims. Muslims who would take Islam for themselves, own it for themselves, and go on to be all that they can be. This is the kind of community that we have to become. We have to support one another. We have to be there for one another. And we cannot be serious about serving society at large if we're not serious about serving each other. We have to get that understood. And in that way, we will become a strong Muslim community that can be a model for others, to whom America can look and say, we have something to learn from that community. Let us go see what we can learn. So on the internal level, let us not forget that it is important for us to take care of each other. To take care of each other. Times are difficult out there. Muslims are suffering emotionally, psychologically. And we have to take care of our brothers and sisters. And we have to see this as part of service. That's what it means. Let me move on to the external issue. And here it gets complicated, and I'm going to have to condense it because my time is running out. But I really think that we have to be very careful. I don't know, maybe it's me, but I don't hear a lot of other communities constantly being confronted with the issue of contributing to society. Asian Americans, I mean, if you're a good Asian American, then you're what? You're contributing to society. You know, Hindu Americans, right? Christian Americans. Somehow when it comes to Muslim Americans, we have to somehow prove ourselves by, quote unquote, contributing to society. I think we have to be very careful about what may be lying underneath that. And by that I mean the following. Non-Muslim Americans, we hear this all the time. They suspect Muslims of wanting to impose their religion on society. Anybody ever heard that? They're getting hungry. One of the reasons that this suspicion is so high, and it's not just ISIS and all that stuff. If I had time, I'd say something about ISIS. Maybe I'll sneak a minute. But non-Muslim Americans have been given this understanding of Islam that everything Muslims do must be strictly dictated by their religion. And for that reason, and I mean their religion in the strict, narrow sense. And for that reason, the only thing they have that they could possibly contribute to society would be what? Religion in that narrow sense. And people are afraid of it. And part of what complicates this situation is that many Muslims too have ultimately internalized that understanding. And that's because we have moved from an understanding of Islam as a religious civilization. Of Islam as a religious civilization, which has its arts, which has its sciences, which has its culture, which has its genius. We've moved from that to Islam as religion in the narrow sense. This we have to be very careful about. And we must get out of this. Because as long as we are that, we are going to be feared in society. Because society is going to understand us of having that and that only to contribute. Non-Muslims may not be able to participate in Islamic religion, but they have always participated in Islamic civilization. Some of you don't believe that. Anybody ever heard of Maimonides? Maimonides is a major Jewish scholar. You know what language Maimonides wrote in? He wrote in Arabic. In Muslim Spain, Christian theologians complained about the fact that their youth couldn't write a letter in Latin, but could produce Arabic poetry more perfect even than the Arabs. And they participated in this Muslim civilization that Muslims had produced. And what we must do again is recapture our connection with Islam as civilization. And by the way, this is not some newfangled idea. Let me give you just one idea, and I'll stop in just a minute. Ibn Hazm, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. Ibn Hazm was a jurist, a faqih, and he wrote 14 volumes on fiqh. He was a legal theoretician. He wrote big fat 4 volumes on legal theory. He was a theologian, a comparative religionist, wrote 4 big volumes on theological comparison of religion. And then you want to know what else he wrote? A book on erotic love. Do you hear what I said? A book on erotic love. Did he see a contradiction between that and his fiqh? Between that and his usul? These were people who were part of Islam that understood itself as civilization. And for that reason, no one had to ask Muslims in Spain, what are you contributing to society? Because it was clear. They contributed sciences. They contributed literature. You go to Spain today. Anyone who goes to Spain today, what's the one thing that sticks out most when you go to Spain? The architecture. And almost all of that architecture is what? Does that architecture come from Quran? Does that architecture come from Sunnah? It is architecture that is inspired by the values and the inspiration of Islam. That Muslims allow their God-given talents to be unleashed, to build society, to add comfort, to add beauty, to add facility. And that's what we have to get comfortable with again. And once we do that, our genius will be unleashed. Our art, our architecture, our legal theory, our pharmaceutical theory. And no one will have to ask, what are Muslims contributing to American society? Everyone will know. And this has to be part of what we understand about who we are as Muslims in the world. Non-Muslim society are not the only ones who have to make some adjustments in mind and in heart. We have some serious adjustments to make. Some serious adjustments to make. And if we ourselves are not able to arrive at a point where we are comfortable in our Islam, to the point that we see no contradiction between our Islam as religion and our Islam as civilization, you want to know what's going to happen? And this is what's happening to many of our young people right now. We will have Islam in terms of the Salat and Ramadan and Zakat, etc. But on everything else outside of that, we will be totally dependent upon someone else. We will be totally dependent on someone else. And so we have to get beyond this narrow understanding of our own deen. And in so doing, we will not have to constantly talk about what we have contributed to society. It will be known. The last point that I want to make about service to the broader society is this, and it's a theme that's been mentioned a number of times tonight, but I just want to put my own iteration on it. One of the services that we can render to American society is, instead of constantly trying to appease bigotry and prejudice, to hold up to America's sight so it can see what it is doing in terms of another chapter in trying to create a problem people. Back in 1963, and I hope you'll pardon my language here. It's not a cuss word, just relax. James Baldwin, famous African-American writer, made a very poignant, pungent statement. Don't repeat this. Abbreviate it or something. Baldwin said this: I am not a nigger. And what America has to figure out is why it needs me to be a nigger. Does that make it easier for you to act on your prejudice? Does that make it easier for you to have a higher, dignified, raised sense of self? Does that make it easier for you to carry out acts of indiscriminate violence? Does that make it easy for you to do that? And what we have to do as Muslims is say, we are not those people who you say we are. And what you have to figure out is why you need us to be that. Why do you need us to be terrorists? Why do you need us to be security threats? And we have to help America by helping America see that. And when we're constantly trying to appease those prejudices, all we do ultimately is strengthen them. This is not service to American society. This is not the kind of service that American society needs. If we are going to be partners in building a better America that is true to its promise, then we have to be, and this has traditionally been the role of minorities in American society, wherever they have been, we have to be the conscience of America. We have to remind America that it is capable of great good, but it is also capable of great evil. And we have to be the ones who protect, in a sense, America from herself. Because if we allow these prejudices to run rampant, they will know no end. And it can happen. So let us be committed to service that's really service, that's based in principle and character. Let us get out of the attitude that we're living in somebody else's land and we have to accept the terms on which they say that we can be American. We are Americans. And just like everyone else defines what that means to them, we define what that means to us. I know this kind of stuff, I know that this kind of stuff is scary. I know it's scary. But I'll end on this fact. You know, when I was sitting there listening to Judge Adam Shakur's talk, I was reminded that, you know, We are now in America reaching the point as a Muslim community that we're generating our own salaf. We're generating our own pious ancestors. People whom 100 years from now we will look back and we will recognize the fact that we are standing on their shoulders. There are people who made it possible even for us to be here, to be Muslims, to have that freedom to do that. We must honor their sacrifices. And we must ensure that we do our part to maintain and uphold and perpetuate what they contributed to bring about. We can't shrink from our responsibility here. There is no exit other than the pursuit of a dignified existence. And if we think that we can preserve ourselves by sitting on the sidelines, we are sadly mistaken. Don't mistake a temporary sort of comfortable situation for a permanent state of security. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, maybe I should tell a joke or something, huh? That was a little heavy, huh? I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us, to recognize where we are, who we are, and what time it is. This is history making time. This is history making time. And we are the makers of history. And the only question that remains is, what history are we going to make? What history are we as a Muslim community in the 21st century in America, what history are we going to make? Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.